Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be discussing how to annihilate the Necron menace. So as you guys know, Necrons have been a very strong faction since the Balanced Data Slate because they were one of the only factions that actually didn't get touched despite a very high tournament win rate. In fact, despite the Eldar's reputation as the best faction in the game, bar none, before the Balanced Data Slate, the Necrons were going toe-to-toe with them and often coming out on top. And of course, probably the best example of this was the finals at LVO, one of the biggest tournaments in Warhammer. So, the Necrons didn't get nerfed, the Eldar did get nerfed after January, and things are looking a lot different. The Eldar, on one hand, while still competitive, are not exactly on the top rung, and Necrons very much are. Necrons are the army to beat, and they are sweeping tournaments left and right. And they have an especially good matchup against the Eldar because with our current nerfs, we can no longer rely on things like Wraithguard to, basically control the midboard. We're going to need to find other options to defeat the Necron menace. Well, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Because as of now, the Necrons happen to be one of the toughest challenges facing the Eldar, not only in competitive play, but also at your local game stores. And luckily for me, I was able to finally get some games in against the Necron menace, running both the Hypercrypt Legion and the Canoptek Court. So today, my hope is to share my experiences with the Eldar community so that you can better arm yourself against the emerging Necron menace. Alright, so what are we going to be looking at in today's video? So first, we're going to be talking about the Necron threat. We're going to be talking about what makes the Necrons so strong. The two strongest Necron detachments, of course, with their special rules and what makes them so good. We're also going to be talking about the most common Necron units and their counters. And lastly, how to position correctly against the Necron menace with a couple of diagrams to illustrate. So how are Necrons doing currently? So I talked a little bit about this, but let's go ahead and look at the numbers. So Necrons have been sweeping the tournament scene with multiple GT wins and a well over 55% win rate. So last time I checked, it was about at 57%, which is exactly where the Eldar were when people were claiming Eldar were the most broken faction in the game. And now Necrons have the exact same win rate. So of course, right, going by that logic, the Necrons have to be the most OP faction in the game now. But they're really not just OP because every other faction at the top got nerfed. They were performing extremely well even before the Balanced Data Slate. So what is making the Necrons so strong? So first of all, they have fantastic character support and really strong data sheets. Their characters are very cheap and they do a lot for their units. And if you compare their support characters to our support characters, for example, Warlocks, there is a massive difference, not only in durability, but also in the way they support their units. Being able to ignore cover for your Wind Riders or giving them stealth is nice, but it's not exactly the same thing as giving your entire unit criticals on a 5+. For, of course, less points than the Warlock Skyrunner. And by the same token, adding a 6-inch advance or a -2 to charge is good, but it's nowhere near compared to giving your unit feel no pain. So right off the bat, Necron characters are some of the best, not only against the Eldar in comparison, but the best in the game. There's just not a lot of characters in the game that do that for their units. They're also an extremely mobile faction, so even though a lot of their units have slower movement values base, they can teleport all around the battlefield. Especially with one of their detachments, they basically don't care about moving slowly in most situations, because they can just teleport there. And that also gets around a lot of the conventional strategies that we have against preventing slower moving armies from advancing up the battlefield, right? If you're going against a slower moving Death Guard army, of course you can block them off by screening out and denying them certain areas of the board by pushing your models forward, right? Using Rangers and Shroud Runners and things like that to block off movement lanes. But against the Necrons, that's not really possible because a lot of their units either fly or they just simply teleport. So there's not much you can do to stop the advance of the Necron hordes. And of course, their data sheets are also super powerful. You have things like the Satan Shards, and there's many different types of Satan Shards. You basically have one for every different type of situation you might come across. But they all have one thing in common, and that's that they're extremely tough. They're all toughness 11, they all have a 4+ invul save, they all have a 5+ feel no pain, and on top of that, they half all of your damage. Yes, they don't have a 2+ armor save like the Avatar of Cain does, but they're cheap enough for it to not matter too much, as you can afford multiple different types of Satan Shards in your army. And of course, their one weakness is that they're kind of slow as well, but again, it doesn't really matter if they can teleport wherever they want on the battlefield, right? So yes, they are slow moving, but when you have the ability to teleport and so forth, it doesn't really matter so much. And this kind of seems really familiar, right? A very fast army that's able to hit very hard and also has very durable units that shouldn't really be fast, but are fast anyway? Sounds like what a lot of Eldar players were running before the nerfs, right? Lots of Wraithguard who could deal a bunch of damage, were extremely fast, and also very durable. And then you also have a lot of units in the army that just half damage and are extremely durable, like the Avatar of Cain and the Incarn, right? So you just have basically a recipe for success, and in a lot of ways, it's the exact same recipe that the Eldar had before the nerfs. Alright, so now that we've talked about why the Necrons are so strong, let's go and talk about the strongest Necron detachments that people are using in competitive play. So it really comes down to two, and that's the Canoptek Court and the Hypercrypt Legion. The Canoptek Court detachment rule is that it can reroll 1s to hit, and this is always, so every single unit in your army gets rerolls of 1 to hit. So already, that's really good. You know, a lot of detachments out there would kill to have something like this. But while they're in their power matrix, models also reroll all hit rolls. So what is a power matrix? Well, the power matrix is basically the Necron's area of control. Their friendly deployment zone is always considered within it. And if you control half or more objectives in no man's land or the enemy's deployment zone, you are also considered within it. And because this detachment relies on using units with very high durability and speed, like Canoptek Wraiths, that's going to happen more often than you would think. Alright, so now that we've kind of talked about the detachment rules and how powerful they are, and they are powerful, let's go and talk about the stratagems and enhancements. One of the most powerful stratagems they have access to is called Contemporal Shift. For 1 command point, it makes the target unit unable to be shot at by models more than 12 inches away. So this is essentially a lone operative type ability, but it's a little bit better because it's on a model by model basis instead of on a unit basis. So normally with lone op, if you have one model in your unit within range, your whole unit can actually shoot at that model. But with Contemporal Shift, it's by a model basis. So if you have one model in range, but the rest of them aren't, I'm sorry, but only that one model can actually shoot, which is of course really strong. They also have reactive subroutines for 1 command point. A Necron unit can make a normal 6-inch move if an opponent comes within 9 inches. A very powerful ability, especially when trying to reposition, and really powerful on large units like Wraiths, who also have fly, and can essentially just fly over your models. So this is the reason why I said earlier that, you know, your normal screening tactics with things like Rangers and Shroud Runners aren't going to really work against the detachment, because of the fact that they can just use this for 1 command point and move over you. As far as their enhancements, they have the Dimensional Sanctum. It grants the user's unit infiltrate, so that's very powerful. There are tools that we have to deal with this, but, you know, being able to infiltrate a huge unit of Wraiths onto an objective in the early game to get that power matrix going is extremely strong. And of course, they also have the Hyperphase Fulcrum, which gives the unit reroll wounds of 1 while in the power matrix. That's pretty good too. Normally, this kind of army doesn't have a rerolls wounds mechanic or something that allows them to reroll wounds. So being able to just do extra damage is really good. Alright, so what about the Hypercrypt Legion? So their detachment rule is that at the end of your opponent's turn, they may pick up 3 units, 2 if you're playing 1,000 points, and 4 if you're playing 3,000 points, and place them in strategic reserve. This is exactly like Swooping Hawks and pretty similar to the Grey Knight's ability, where you can essentially just pick units up at the end of your opponent's turn, place them in reserve, and then have them come out on the board in strategic reserve or deep strike in most cases. Now, of course, this is an extremely powerful ability in an objective-based game, right? Being able to just pick up whole units, no matter how expensive they are, and move them across the battlefield is absolutely bonkers. And it makes some units that were pretty mediocre before, like the Necron Monolith, become god tier units, which essentially covers the army's weaknesses altogether because, Necrons are pretty slow normally. They really do need something like this to be able to move across the battlefield quickly. And of course, lastly, there is a nasty combination that you can use with this and the Monolith, because the Monolith's Eternity Gate does synergize with this ability, as reserves do come into play in the order of your opponent's choosing. But what about the Hypercrypt Legion stratagems and enhancements? Well, I have to tell you guys, they're some of the best in the game. The Dimensional Overseer enhancement allows one additional unit to come from reserve via their detachment ability. So instead of 3 units, it's now 4 units. This is going to be pretty much an auto-include in most armies, I feel, but it's not that many points. And it allows you to bring in an additional unit and teleport it. Enough said. That's without a doubt going to be extremely strong. They also have the Arisen Tyrant ability, which allows the bearer's unit to reroll hit rolls of 1 or all hit rolls if it just came from reserve. And guess what, guys? They're mostly going to be coming from reserve, so they're going to be rerolling all their hit rolls when they drop down. As for their enhancements, they have Hyperphasic Recall, which is 2 command points, a little bit expensive, but it does allow an infantry unit to teleport to a Monolith after being shot at or attacked in combat. This is extremely powerful. This is something my buddy wanted to set up when he played me with his double Monolith list. Unfortunately for him, he didn't quite have the command points. He didn't really think that one out too, deeply. But it is an extremely powerful ability and can save a huge Necron unit from certain death. They also have Cosmic Precision for 1 command point. It allows a Necron unit to deep strike or hyperphase in, and hyperphase being coming from reserve via the detachment ability within 3 inches. So this is also extremely powerful because it prevents your ability to screen out every single Necron unit that you come across, especially in the later stages of the game when you're not going to have as many units to work with. Cosmic Precision is what basically won the LVO tournament for the Hypercrypt Legion Necron player. And it's definitely a stratagem that you have to be aware of and be very careful of. They also have Dimensional Corridor, which is pretty good. Basically 2 command points that allows a unit coming through the Monolith's Eternity Gate to charge. And this is really good because this is normally restricted, right? When you come out of the Monolith's Eternity Gate, the stipulation is that you can't charge afterward. But this actually does allow you to charge. So could be very powerful potentially to get onto an objective and take an objective away from an opponent. Alright, so as you guys can see, the Hypercrypt Legion and the Canoptek Court are some of the most powerful detachments, not only for the Necrons, but in the entire game. But what are the most common Necron units that they will bring, and of course, the units that can counter them? So there are quite a few of them, but I will talk about the ones you'll probably see the most in a Necron army, and those are of course the Immortals, the Canoptek Wraiths, the Plasmancer, the Techromancer, the Monolith, Canoptek Scarab Swarms, and lastly, the Great Satan. So let's go ahead and start off with Immortals, because those are probably the most common infantry you will see with the new Necron Codex. So they are an elite shooting unit with toughness 5 and a 3+ save, so they're pretty durable. Remember also that they do get reanimation protocols, so if you don't kill the whole unit in one go, they're going to be getting back up. And that is just basically a tip against Necrons in general, is that if you don't kill the whole unit through, the reanimation protocols and the resurrection orbs and things like that, most likely they're going to be standing up the very next turn. Now, as far as the weapons the Immortals are equipped with, they will probably be equipped with Tesla carbines, which have a strength of 5 and AP of 0, 2 shots at damage 1 with sustained hits 2, and assault. These are the most popular version because, of course, having assault weapons is really good this edition because you're still eligible to score on secondaries. And on top of that, because they have sustained hits too, it makes them a really big Overwatch threat, and it synergizes really well with another one of the characters, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So in essence, Immortals are just really good at killing infantry, especially light infantry like Eldar, because we have typically a lower save and lower toughness. We are the premier target for Tesla carbines. But of course, the good news is that Tesla carbines don't do anything against armor. If you have something with a 2-up armor save in your list, like a Wraith Lord or Wraith Guard or Wraith Blades even, they're going to have a lot of trouble getting through that. And that brings us to the counters to Immortals. So what counters Immortals and what can we use to kill them and survive the withering fire that is the Tesla Carbine? Well, the first thing we can do is just kill them with Shuriken Cannons. Shuriken Cannons do very solid damage with Strength 6, so you're wounding them on a 3+. You're at AP -1, so unless they're in cover, they're basically at a 4+ save. And these can do very good damage against them. And again, it doesn't matter much with Shuriken Cannons, but they are wound 1. So even things like Last Blasters from your Swooping Hawks, or, things like the Disperse Shot on Shadow Specters can do some serious work into these guys, especially when supported by Shroud Runners. Because you can mark one of these with lethal hits, and all of a sudden your Scatter Lasers and your Shuriken Cannons and all those kind of weapons are hitting much harder against them. Wraith Blades are actually also extremely durable against them and devastate them in combat. So one of the things I found while playing against my buddy was that even 2 fully kitted out units of Immortals with the character support, the Monolith in support as well, cannot kill a unit of Wraith Blades in a single shooting phase. In fact, on average dice, 2 units of Immortals and a Necron Monolith shooting at a unit of Wraith Blades on an objective with a Spirit Seer only kills about 4 of them. And out of the 4 that on average die, most of them die to the Monolith itself and the characters themselves with their ranged weapons and special abilities to deal mortal wounds. The actual Immortals do very little damage against them, and in fact will struggle to kill even 1 Wraith Guard. Or of course, Wraith Blade. And you're probably going to be using Wraith Blades because that's kind of the more durable and cheap unit to use now since the nerfs to Wraith Guard happened. Wraith Lords and Wraith Seers are really durable as well against the Tesla Carbines, but don't fare so well against the Monolith. So do be careful. A Wraith Lord can definitely hold an objective against Tesla Carbines and Immortals, but has a lot of trouble doing it versus the tougher stuff like the Monolith. Canoptek Wraiths are also a unit that you're going to come across a lot against a Necron player. They're fast and tough with a movement of 10, toughness 6, 4 wounds apiece, and a 4+ invul save. They have decent damage as well with short-ranged devastating wound pistols that have 3 attacks apiece, and damage to melee weapons that hit at strength 6, AP -1. Now, they do have some counters, even though they are very fast and they're very tough. Shuriken Cannons are very effective against them, especially with Wind Riders, who will get rerolls to hit if they're on objectives, and Canoptek Wraiths love to sit on objectives. Shroud Runners can also mark them, giving your army lethal hits against them, making them much more vulnerable against lower strength weapons, like, Shuriken Catapults and things of that nature. And just like against the Immortals, under the effects of Fortune, Wraith Blades can go toe-to-toe with them in combat as long as the Technomancer is destroyed. So the Technomancer is going to be the character that is attaching to these guys to give them feel no pain. As long as that model's dead, these guys aren't nearly as scary. And Wraith Blades take them out very easily because they have strength 7 weapons, so they're wounding them on 3+. They have lethal hits and +1 to hit because of the Spirit Seer. And in general, they're just harder to kill because they have toughness 7 versus the strength 6 of the Canoptek Wraiths' Vicious Claws. And of course, under the effects of Fortune, they're going to be needing 6s to wound. So yes, Wraith Blades under the effects of Fortune absolutely dominate these things in close combat. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the Necron characters you might come across. So the Plasmancer is the first one and probably the one you're most familiar with because it is a support character that gives the unit critical hits on a 5+, which is extremely powerful with Immortals. It can only join Immortals and Necron Warriors, so you don't have to worry about this thing joining Wraiths and giving them, devastating wounds on 5+. But even so, sustained hits 2 on a 5+ is very strong during the shooting phase. Now, this is something that I kind of misunderstood the first time I was reading through the Codex. It's only when they shoot in the shooting phase. It's not when they Overwatch. So don't think it also works with Overwatch. It only works in the shooting phase, thank God. But not only do they do that, but they also have the chance to deal mortal wounds. Now, it's not much. They roll 46, and on the roll of a 4+ for each one, they get a mortal wound. So on average, they'll do about 2 mortal wounds. They do have a pretty powerful range attack as well, which, isn't nothing, but it's also not the most powerful thing in the world. However, again, when you compare the weapon that it has, the ranged weapon and the melee weapon, that it's armed with other codexes like Eldar or even Space Marines. I'll even go out on a limb and say Space Marines, Imperial Guard, other factions essentially. You're getting a lot more for those 45 points than those other factions are for their support characters. So, hopefully when the Necrons are balanced and when, GW goes back and rebalances some of the things in the next balance day slate, they look at support characters and they specifically look at what they can do to make them more on par with each other. Okay, so having said that, we all know the Plasmancer is really good, but what are his counters? So luckily, he's not that durable. Precision weapons can eliminate them fairly effectively as they only have a 4+ save and 4 wounds. Now, as far as the toughness goes, they will match the toughness of the unit they're with. They will have toughness 5, of course, just like the Immortals. But sniper rifles can still take these guys out because they have AP -1. And of course, we are the Eldar. We get a couple of rerolls in there. We can also throw Doom in there. We can Doom the unit. And typically speaking, you're going to want to take the whole unit out anyway. So you're probably going to also be benefiting from lethal hits with Shroud Runners and stuff like that. So are these guys really durable? Yeah, the unit's durable, but the character isn't. And only having 4 wounds means that you can essentially auto-kill it with Eldrad, with, just a fate dice roll of a 4 for damage. Or you can use a couple of snipers, and if a couple of snipers get through, that's it. He's dead. Okay, but what about the Technomancer? Because the Technomancer is a little bit different. They're with Wraiths instead of with the Immortals. So basically, the support character gives his unit 5+ Feel No Pain, which does make the unit a lot more durable, especially with Wraiths. It can also heal D3 wounds to a nearby friendly unit, which is probably going to be his own unit most of the time. So, he can heal his unit twice, essentially, one with reanimation protocols and once with his ability. And he himself is not necessarily more durable than any other Cryptek, but because he's with Wraiths, it automatically makes him more durable. And, he is getting a 5+ Feel No Pain as well. So what are his counters? Well, even though he is more durable, precision weapons can still eliminate them pretty effectively as he only has a 4+ save and 4 wounds. So despite the toughness 6 and the 5+ Feel No Pain, if you're still able to shove enough precision weaponry through, you have an Eldrad in there, or you have a couple of, maybe a squad of Shroud Runners, and you have a unit of Rangers firing at him and you get line of sight, you can still kill him pretty effectively. However, if you can't quite draw line of sight to the Technomancer because he's hiding behind a wall or something like that, then you're probably just going to have to kill the unit to a man. Once you kill the unit and the Technomancer is the only one left, the unit cannot resurrect. And at that point, the Technomancer is just going to be out on his own and is not going to have a lot of value going forward. All right, so next up is the most iconic Necron model in the entire codex. And of course, I'm talking about the Monolith. A towering pyramid of doom that can teleport units from reserve or on the battlefield to its location. It's very tough with a 2-up save, toughness 13 and 22 wounds. It is basically a super heavy. It has, kind of the profile that you would expect of something like a Baneblade. And it can also very easily get a 4+ invulnerable save with a Hypercrypt Legion stratagem, which is usually pretty redundant on most Necron vehicles as they already have a 4+ invul save, but on the Monolith, because it doesn't come with one base, it can be an absolute nightmare to take down. It can also be armed with either Gauze Flux Rays or the Mighty Death Rays, which is what you want. The Death Rays are the best. They're basically souped up Mega Bright Lances. And a Particle Whip, which is an anti-mech kind of weapon with devastating wounds. So it's a pretty powerful vehicle. It has both a lot of toughness and a lot of weaponry. And it has the utility of being able to transport other models on the battlefield to its location. So what are its counters? Now, I think the biggest counter to this thing, of course, is the D-Cannons. They're one of the few weapons in the Eldar book that wounded on 3+, and they can also deal devastating wounds on top of it. So even if your opponent uses that 4+ invul strat, they're still going to have trouble keeping this thing alive if they're going against enough D-Cannons. And of course, the typical thing to do nowadays is to bring 3 of them. But even 2 D-Cannons can do significant damage to a Monolith. Fire Prisms are also very good. Again, this thing is towering and titanic, so it can pretty much always be seen. Triple Prisms is a very effective counter against the Monolith. Yes, it can get an invul save, but your opponent does have to spend CP for that. And if they don't, they're only going to get a 6+ save. So Triple Prism, if you have 3 prisms on the battlefield, you should be able to also do significant damage to it. The Avatar of Kane's Overwatch can carve it up if teleporting. So if this thing teleports within 9 inches of your Avatar of Kane, you can Overwatch it, get some good damage on it that way as well. Of course, using a Strands Dice of a 6 to proc that automatic sustained hits, so you can do significant damage. Also, Fire Dragons. So a lot of people don't think of it because Fire Dragons are low strength, but quite frankly, they have about the same amount of damage against it that a Bright Lance does. And the Bright Lance is still wounding on 5s. These guys are wounding on 5s. The difference is they get to reroll damage rolls of 1, as well as wound rolls of 1. And if they're coming out of a Falcon, they get to reroll all of their wounds, which 9 out of 10 times is probably what's going to be happening. Fuegan is also very good. Melt a 6, so if his shot does go through that invul save, you're automatically going to be able to do 12 damage, which is more than half of the wounds that this thing has, and that's not even counting the Fire Dragons and the Falcon, which are also going to be contributing a lot of damage as well. So while the Monolith is indeed pretty durable, it's by no means invincible, and it does fall to the concentrated firepower of anti-large damage, which of course the Eldar have plenty of. D-Cannons, the Avatar of Kane, Fire Dragons, and of course Fire Prisms all do a very good job at bringing it down. The only weapon that really struggles to kill these things is of course the Bright Lance. Bright Lances are the premier anti-large weapon in our arsenal, but against Toughness 13, they really just lack the punch to do any significant damage, and especially when you consider that this thing can pop a 4+ invul save for a command point. Alright, so now we have the Canoptek Scarab Swarms. So these are pretty cheap fodder. There's not really much to say about them. They're going to be in Necron lists. They're going to be annoying, but they're toughness 2, and they're pretty much only used for disruption and secondary objectives. They can deal mortals to vehicles in combat and have lethal hits, but otherwise they're extremely easy to kill and don't do much damage. And your opponent probably isn't going to be trying to do damage with these things. They're probably going to be wanting to score secondaries. So what are the counters to these little buggers? Well, basically anything. They basically die to anything. Anti-infantry weapons are going to be the most effective, though. They wound them on 2s because of the toughness 2. These guys don't have a save. They have a 6+ save, which is pretty negligible. So anything strength 4, even your basic shuriken catapults will spell doom for these things. All right, so now for the most feared model in the Necron Codex, and that is of course the Satan. It is the topic of many assaulty posts on Reddit and so forth. Basically, the Satan is a walking fortress and an absolute nightmare for people to deal with. They're extremely durable with toughness 11, a 4+ invul save, a 5+ feel no pain, and half damage on top of it all. They're also very powerful in close combat and have powerful weapons. And the different Satans are better against certain targets, but they're all pretty good in general. They're not incredibly fast, but have access to teleportation via abilities, and of course the Hypercrypt Legion Detachment. And overall, these guys are just really strong in almost every way, because for all of these things that they get, they're only about 260 to 280 points. They're not expensive. They're less than the Avatar of Kane, they're a lot less than the Yinkarn, and in general, they're just really powerful for the points. And of course, if you don't kill them in one round, because they're Necrons, they get to heal. So, on top of the feel no pain and all that other stuff that they get, they also get to heal their own wounds. All right, so let's talk about the counters. Now, I did a video on a possible counter to these guys, and I've actually used this in a game recently against a Satan Shard, and it did fairly well. So Fire Dragons are very good against them, just point for point. Will a unit of Fire Dragons kill the Satan in one round? No, but they'll do a lot of damage, and they'll definitely do their points worth in damage to it. The Canoptek Wraith Knight is also very good at killing it. I hope I pronounced it right that time. There's always somebody correcting me on the pronunciation of this thing. I will get it right eventually. But it has the Infernal Lances, which are melted too. And because they're range 24, you can get within, 12 inches out of deep strike and still be able to benefit from the Melta. So that Wraith Knight is extremely good at killing these as well, because each Infernal Lance has 4 shots. So of course you can throw Guide on this thing, reroll all your hits. You're already rerolling one of your wounds because of your detachment ability. But you could have Eldrad in there to throw in a Doom, so you're wounding on 2+ as well. And your opponent fails half of those. You're within Melter range. They're halving your D6 damage, but you're getting all that bonus Melter damage. You're going to be able to do some significant work against the C'tan. And even if you can get it within a few wounds, mass anti-infantry with lethal hits is also very decent because they don't have a good armor save. They only have that invul. So, Swooping Hawks and things like that can also deal a significant amount of chip damage to finish them off. Bright Lances are also okay, but they're very swingy. You do hit on 3s, wound on 3s against these things, but because, you have the Feel No Pain, you have the 4-up invul, they just might not be that powerful. D-Cannons are also decent, but you really need multiple platforms to deal significant damage, again, because of the fact that these guys have half damage and Feel No Pain. So basically, these things are going to take a very concentrated amount of anti-large firepower to take down. Fire Dragons are very good at it. D-Cannons are decent, Bright Lances are decent, but really I think the best bang for your buck is going to be the Fire Dragons with the Falcon. And I actually do have a video on this covering how Fire Dragons are probably the best value for killing C'tans in our index as we know it. So if you want to check that out, it is definitely on my channel's page. All right, so now that we've talked about what's effective against the meta Necron units, how do you position correctly against the Necron Menace? Because that's all well and good. You can know the matchup and you can know the counters and the different units that you have that are effective against your opponent. But if you don't know how to position correctly, you might be fighting an uphill battle from the offset, because both of the detachments that are the most popular with Necrons are extremely mobile. They're very fast. Both the Canoptek Court and the Hypercrypt Legion can basically drop units in the midboard turn 1, and even in your own deployment zone in the case of the Hypercrypt Legion. So to counter the game plan of your Necron opponent, you're going to need to know how to screen out infiltrators and deep strikers and be able to secure primary objectives early in order to bait your opponent out in the open. So for this video, we are going to be using Terrain Layout 1 to explain what to do and where to position your units. This works for every single terrain layout though, so don't worry, if you roll a different layout, it's not going to drastically change what your game plan is. All right, so this first diagram is going to kind of explain how to deny enemy infiltrators. This is especially important against the Canoptek Court to prevent them from getting units onto objectives early and activating that power matrix, which gives them rerolls to hit. So in this example, we have 2 units of Rangers. Now, what we've done here is we've spread them out about 9 inches away from the enemy deployment zone, but slightly overlapping on the objective. You'll see the little dots, the red dots there are our Rangers, of course, and we've spread them out each 2 inches. And when they're spread out, at least 2 inches apart, they actually cover about 14 inches across. And then on top of that, enemies cannot infiltrate within 9 inches of them. So essentially what you have here is 2 units of Rangers denying the entire midboard, except for, a couple of inches in the center, right? You have about maybe 7 or 8 inches in the middle of the board where your opponent can infiltrate. Of course, that is what we call the infiltration zone in light green. Now, this does one or two things. Firstly, it denies your opponent the ability to actually get on those early objectives to activate the power matrix, but it does something else. It falsely baits your opponent into thinking they have a place to deploy. So they can deploy anywhere in that infiltration zone, and they may look at that and say, oh my God, he left something open. And they might just jump at the opportunity. But this is actually a cleverly laid trap. I wanted my opponent to deploy there, because what I'm going to do with the rest of my army is I'm going to have them on the flanks, and I'm going to have a unit of D-cannons behind that piece of terrain in my deployment zone waiting for his unit to come onto the middle objective. Yes, he may be able to, take that objective turn 1, but 2 turns of D-cannon fire should put an end to any ill-conceived aspirations. And guys, 3 D-cannons is more than enough to deal with a unit of Canoptek Wraiths. Canoptek Wraiths are good, don't get me wrong, but when you're shooting 3 D-cannons at them for 2 turns straight, they're going to have issues. Now, on the other sides of the board, if I get the first turn, the first thing I'm doing is I'm moving the Rangers out of the way. Frankly, because I know that the Canoptek Wraiths have fly, and I also can't really tie them up in combat because, they're actually good in combat, right? They're not Necron warriors or anything like that. They will destroy the Rangers in combat very quickly. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm either going to look for angles to try to pick off their characters, right? Kill their characters, or I'm going to just retreat and make it harder for them to actually deal with the Rangers so that the Rangers can have value later on in the game. Maybe the Rangers are going after objectives. Maybe they're, sneaking into the enemy deployment zone, whatever it is. But they're definitely not going to try to engage the Wraiths in combat. However, this is also what I like to call distraction bait. Basically using your unit of Rangers to move into the enemy deployment zone and force your opponent to use their Canoptek Wraiths or their other units in their army to deal with those Rangers, and thus slowing them from getting to the objectives. Meanwhile, while the enemy is distracted with my Rangers or taking D-cannon shots over and over again, I can move my Wraithblades up onto a objective in no man's land, either the left side or the right side, and secure it for myself, either the Avatar of Cain, of course, or the almighty Wraithblades, both of which are extremely durable and won't typically lose to a unit of Canoptek Wraiths without some significant support behind them. And this is essentially how you prevent yourself from getting boxed in as the Eldar player against a very durable and quick list like the Canoptek Court. The next example we're going to talk about is, of course, how to prevent deep striking via the Hypercrypt Legion. So the Hypercrypt Legion is going to be deep striking all game, every game. That's their thing, right? Every turn they get a deep strike something else. And when they come down, chances are they're going to kill whatever they appear near, with a few exceptions, right? Most of our units are very squishy. So how do we prevent this from happening? Well, the short answer is you kind of don't. Your opponent is going to be able to deep strike basically wherever they want to. However, what you can prevent them from doing is deep striking in positions where they can attack your most vulnerable units. So we have an example here, and it's going to be kind of hard to see because a lot of the dots are just, dots. But essentially, these could be your infantry units, your Swooping Hawks, your Storm Guardians, your Wraithblades. But in the game that I played against my opponent, I was actually using a triple Falcon list. And again, those triangles that you see there, those red triangles, they could be any vehicle. They could be fire prisms. They could be, whatever you have, wave serpents, whatever. But they're going to be behind those pieces of terrain, and around them are going to be the infantry. Now, the goal in this is to only create enough room for a single unit to deep strike in your backfield. A single unit of Immortals, a single Canoptek Scarab unit, and definitely not the Monolith. So the one thing you don't want to allow in your deployment zone, of course, is the Monolith, but the Monolith is pretty big. So as long as you have the bodies to block it off, it's not going to have much space to maneuver. And in fact, even with the 3-inch deep strike, it's really going to be hard to actually deep strike it in a 2,000-point game. And in this situation, you might actually want to use your Rangers in your own backfield. So if you have a unit of Rangers, instead of forward deploying them, if your opponent doesn't have any infiltrators, which they probably won't, then you can use them as extra bodies in your own deployment zone so that you don't get monolithed on turn 1. And of course, with this deployment, they will have some spaces to deep strike in your backfield because, you're not a Horde army. You're not running an Imperial Guard infantry, Horde spam army. You're going to have spaces in your deployment zone that are open, but your opponent is probably not going to be able to deploy in areas that are that big. And if they are, again, the goal is to minimize the amount of units they can actually drop in. So essentially what's going to happen in this scenario is once your opponent finds out that they can't deep strike in your backfield, they're going to just probably deploy somewhere in the midboard, right? Which is outlined in the deep strike zones in green. And all of those zones right there are completely fine. If your opponent deep strikes right in front of your army, that's the best thing that can happen. Because you have line of sight to them, and they don't have line of sight to your most vulnerable units. So yeah, they may be able to ice a unit of Storm Guardians. They may be able to, shoot at some Wraith Guard. But they're not going to kill the Wraith Guard, and the Storm Guardians are expendable. The Rangers are expendable. If you trade a unit of Storm Guardians for 2 units of Immortals, you are doing a fantastic job. And the great thing about playing Eldar is that if they have a Monolith on their field, and it's within 24 inches of D-cannons at any time, that thing is going to be in a world of hurt. And also keep in mind that the Monolith is towering, so you can see it even if it's behind obscuring terrain. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about our last example, which is how to secure primary objectives. So a lot of the times, players get caught off guard by this because Necrons can, deep strike with their Monolith using the Hypercrypt Legion rules, and then they can deploy their units outside of the Monoliths up to 6 inches. And this does not have to be outside of 9 inches of you. And a lot of people don't understand that, but that's the special rule of the Monolith's ability. It's not technically a transport. It's a different rule set. So that means that those units can come really close to you and actually take objectives away from you. So how do you secure objectives against this type of Necron strategy, especially when they can charge you for 2 CP points afterward? Well, in my opinion, the best way to do this is with a super tough unit. The Avatar of Khaine works because the Avatar of Khaine is great in combat and can slaughter Immortals as they come in. But the better unit, I think, to deal with it is Wraithblades. So this is actually something that happened to me in my game against Necrons, against my Necron buddy the other day. And essentially, I got the first turn and I moved, advanced, and of course, I also used Fire and Fade on my unit of Wraithblades to move them up onto the center objective, and I basically made it so that my opponent could not land inside of the objective marker. So essentially, my 10 Wraithblades fully had it surrounded, and there was no place, even if he did assault in, there was no place for them to get any OC on the objective. What he did at that point was he thought that it would be possible for 2 Immortal units and a Necron Monolith to come down and shoot the Wraithblades off the objective. The way he figured it was he'd played games against Marine players before with Terminator units, 10-man Terminator units, and if he was able to kill them, then of course he'd be able to kill the Wraithblades, right? But unfortunately for my opponent, there's a big difference between wounding Terminators on 4+ and wounding Wraithblades on 6+. Out of all the Immortals, he fired 20 Immortals off with 5+ critical hits, plus the Phasmancers as well, providing some extra firepower and mortal wounds. He did a total of 2 wounds to my Wraithblades. He didn't even kill a single Wraithblade with the 2 units of Immortals. Now, the Plasmancers themselves did actually manage to kill 1 with their special ability to deal mortal wounds. So in total, he had 2 kills so far. His Monolith fired on him and only killed 2 because they also had Fortune on them and they also have a 4+ invulnerable save. So all that firepower, that's, over 600 points of firepower. Actually, it's closer to about 700 points. Only killed 4 Wraithblades. That was pretty much game because after that, his 2 big blocks of Immortals were destroyed. He didn't have the command points to pull them back to the other Monolith because he had already used them on the other side of the battlefield. And yeah, the Wraithblades charged in, wiped out the Necrons, and the Monolith was destroyed by D-cannons. Now, is this going to work against every single opponent every time? Probably not. I think if somebody knew their math hammer very well, they wouldn't try something like this. But that's exactly why it's powerful. Because even if my opponent didn't do this, the fact of the matter is he has nothing to deal with those blades. They're going to sit there turn after turn after turn, weathering firepower and capping primary objective points. Even if he brings a Satan Shard over there, which by the way, later in the game, he actually did do it. Later in the game on about turn 4, he was finally able to bring one over. It just wasn't enough. With the support from the rest of my army, I was easily able to deal with that threat. So to beat the Hypercrypt Legion, you do need to secure those objectives in the midboard. You do need a strong and durable unit to be able to do it. Either Wraithblades, Wraith Guard are okay at it, but they're not so great at it anymore because of the nerfs. They also don't have an invul save, so against those high AP attacks, they're not as strong. But having said that, Wraith Guard are just as durable as Wraithblades against a unit like Immortals, so they can also work. Wraith Lords are also very durable against Immortals. If your opponent is just firing Immortals at them, it's not going to do much. And also the Wraith Knight. I didn't mention this, but the Wraith Knight can also very easily do this. The Wraith Knight has a pretty large base, so it can cover most of the objective and can prevent units from getting on that objective. And it's toughness 12. You can give it fortune. And of course, if it's, the Wraith Knight that has the Infernal Lances, the Mighty Skathak Wraith Knight, then, you can survive and you can have OC 10 on that objective. So your opponent is not going to be able to get it from you easily. Although, just to be clear, I think the Wraithblades are the clear winner here. Even the Avatar of Cain, while good, is not necessarily going to be able to survive as much firepower as 10 Wraithblades will. Alright, so in conclusion, Necrons are definitely the army to beat right now and can be extremely oppressive if unprepared. However, with good screening and knowing which units can effectively take out their biggest threats, you will be able to do pretty good against them. And again, being able to secure those primary objectives, I can't tell you enough and I can't stress enough how important that is against Necrons. You do need something tough that can battle it out in the midfield against them. And that's not the case for every army out there. I'm not saying that's something you should always have in your competitive lists. But, if you are going up against Necrons, this is something that you definitely need. Because they're not like other armies. You can't just expect to kill them on the objective and then put something weak there, and just purely outmaneuver them, because they have the maneuverability and they have the durability to match you. What they typically don't have is the raw firepower needed to kill a unit of Wraithblades or an Avatar of Cain at range or in close combat. Because quite frankly, the Satan are powerful, but they're not quite powerful enough to one-round an Avatar of Cain. So yeah, even though the Necrons are the top dogs right now, I do think the Eldar still have a few tricks up their sleeves against them. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. I hope that helped, and I hope that, anybody out there who's facing a lot of Necrons that is having trouble, looks at this video and maybe gets a few tips from it that can be useful. I'm going to be real with you guys. I was a little bit intimidated at first too. The Satan Shards are very intimidating. The Monoliths are very intimidating. The fact that they can deep strike all over the battlefield, it does sound really crazy. But when it comes down to it, if you can, follow the steps I told you guys about, deny infiltrators if you're facing Canoptek Court, be able to, kind of screen out deep strikers from the vital spots of your deployment zone, and of course, secure those objectives, you'll be just fine. And of course, thank you once again to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you also want to help support the channel, I do have free trials activated via my Patreon, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategies, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to check out some Eldar-inspired apparel on my channel store page, or purchase some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave the links in the description for those also. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Let me know in the comments what you guys thought. What are your strategies for dealing with the Necron menace? And I will see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.